Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the channel Strange Night Podcast. Story 1. The Blind Wanderer. The United States in the 1970s and 1980s was a vast country with an intricate network of highways where freedom of movement also meant anonymity. This anonymity was the perfect shield for Coral Eugene Watts, a nomadic serial killer who sowed terror across multiple states without leaving any clear, consistent trace, confounding police for decades. Watts, a tall black man with an ordinary appearance, hailed from Michigan. He lacked the charm or the superintelligence of some other serial killers. He was a mechanic, a simple laborer who moved frequently for work, and this constant mobility was the key to his crimes. He became known by the moniker the Sunday Killer because most of his attacks and murders occurred on weekends. What made Watts terrifying was the extreme randomness of his modus operandi, method of operation. He had no consistent victim type or crime signature. Victims. He targeted women of all ages, from teenagers to the elderly. Methods. He used various means: strangulation, stabbing, or drowning. Locations. From parking lots to private homes or secluded roads. Watts killed because of the devil's eyes. He claimed he was driven by demonic spirits and that he had to see the ultimate look of fear in his victim's eyes. He often carried murder tools and waited for the perfect moment to attack. Due to this randomness, police in cities like Detroit, Ann Arbor, Houston, and Los Angeles failed to connect the murders. They were looking for a killer with a pattern, while Watts was an invisible monster, a geographically blind wanderer, but extremely lucid in terms of tactics. Watts's downfall happened by chance in Texas in 1982. He was arrested after attempting to abduct 2 women in a parking lot. During the investigation, police found a notebook with drawings of women Watts had seen, but no direct evidence of the murders. In a controversial turn, Texas prosecutors reached a deal with Watts. He would confess to 12 murders in Texas in exchange for a lighter sentence for the assault and kidnapping charge, and, crucially, for immunity from prosecution for any other murders he might have committed in Texas. This deal caused immense public outrage. Watts was sentenced to only 60 years in prison, with the possibility of early release. However, the story did not end there. Thanks to the persistence of investigators and the advancement of DNA technology, cold cases in Michigan were reconnected. In 2004, Watts was extradited to Michigan and convicted of 2 more counts of first-degree murder. Although the confirmed victim count stands at 14, police believe the true number could be over 100 victims across the U.S. The story of Coral Eugene Watts is a deep wound on the justice system. He exploited the inefficiency of information sharing between states and the naivety of the legal system to nearly escape justice. He is the embodiment of nomadic evil, who turned America's highways into a hunting ground, forever a haunting reminder that a killer can hide in the shadows of anonymity. Story 2. The Killer at the Border. Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, a city just across the border from El Paso, Texas, was a booming industrial hub in the 1990s. It was a place of hope and opportunity, especially for the thousands of young women working in the assembly plants, maquiladoras. But for these women, Juarez turned into a hunting ground, where poverty and the chaos of the border region facilitated a series of devastating crimes. The femicides of Juarez. This episode focuses on one specific figure, Abdel Latif Sharif, an Egyptian chemical engineer who was accused of being the initial serial killer in this decades-long tragedy. Sharif moved to Juarez in the early 90s for work. He was an educated foreigner, initially above suspicion. However, his perversion quickly manifested as he targeted young women, particularly maquiladora workers, who often walked to work early in the morning or late at night. Sharif's victims were typically abducted, sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled, then left in the desert or abandoned lots. His crimes began in 1993, causing widespread fear in the community. In 1995, Sharif was arrested. Mexican police declared him the serial killer responsible for numerous cases. Evidence against him, including confessions and physical proof, led to his conviction and imprisonment. Authorities hoped Sharif's arrest would end the terror. However, the chilling story did not stop there. After Sharif was incarcerated, the murders continued to occur. This exposed an even more horrifying truth. Abdel Latif Sharif was just one of many predators. His crimes were shielded by social chaos and the inefficiency of the local police. Activists and victims' families began to accuse the police and local officials of attempting to blame all crimes on a foreigner to quell public outrage, ignoring the fact that one or more other killers were still operating freely. Juarez became a symbol of systemic failure. The murdered women were often poor, marginalized, and their deaths were not prioritized by the authorities. Sharif was later sentenced to death for one murder and received 30 years for two others. He died in prison in 2006. Yet his death did not end the tragedy in Juarez. The killings, though they decreased, continued to linger. The story of the killer at the border is a cold reminder of the dangerous intersection between psychopathic crime and social decay. It exposes how the chaos of the border region, poverty, and discrimination against women became fertile ground for predators. Abdel Latif Sharif. Sharif may have been a monster, but the fact that the murders continued after his capture proved he was only a small part of a larger, darker shadow. A wound in Ciudad Juarez that never truly healed. Story 3. The Orphanage Curse. This story takes us to one of society's darkest corners, where the desperation of young mothers was exploited to conceal a terrible crime: the murder of children for profit. Although the original story of the most famous angel maker is in England, we will explore the prevalence and similar cruelty of this type of crime, set in a developing country like the Philippines, where weak humanitarian structures become the perfect cover for greed and evil. In the 1950s, in a crowded slum in Manila, Philippines, many poor young women were seeking a godparent or a place to entrust their illegitimate children. The consequences of war and poverty made adoption or finding a caretaker their only option. And that is when a woman known in the community as Tita Caring, Auntie Caring, appeared. Tita Caring ran an informal orphanage, or a private foster home. She had a warm demeanor, frequently engaged in small charity activities, and quickly earned the trust of desperate mothers, promising a better life for their babies. However, the truth inside that house was hell. Tita Caring neither nurtured nor sought adoptive parents for the children. Her sole purpose was to collect the initial fee from the mothers. After receiving the money, she would quickly murder the babies. The method of killing was often starvation, neglect, or mild poisoning, making the children's deaths easily attributed to illness or malnutrition, causes that were far too common in that impoverished area. For a long time, no one suspected anything. Why? Because these mothers were often isolated, afraid to publicly seek out their children for fear of social stigma. These babies were born in the shadows and disappeared in silence. The horror was only exposed when one of Tita Caring's neighbors became suspicious of the number of children entering and leaving her house, especially the terrible stench and her frequent burying of small packages in the backyard. Police eventually raided the home. They found not only surviving children in terribly neglected conditions, but also evidence of multiple children's bodies buried in the back garden. Police estimated that Tita Caring had killed at least more than 20 infants and young children over the years of her operation. The story of Tita Caring and the angel makers in the Philippines is a heartbreaking tragedy of greed and the exploitation of trust. It exposes a dark side of society where poverty and social pressure push the most vulnerable into the hands of brutal psychopaths. Her crime was not just murder, but the killing of the last hope of desperate mothers, turning the false orphanage into a factory for small coffins. This is a curse not only on the children, but on the society that allowed evil masquerading as benevolence to thrive for so long. Story 4. Highway haunting. The United States, a country connected by thousands of miles of interstate highways, is home to a unique working class, the long-haul truck drivers. They are invisible, constantly moving, and for Keith Hunter Jesperson, better known as the Happy Face Killer, these roads were the perfect battlefield for his homicidal urges. Jesperson was a large, strong man who drove trucks across multiple states. His life was a long string of personal failures and anger, particularly after his marriage dissolved. This anger morphed into a sick need for control and destruction. From 1990 to 1995, Jesperson murdered at least 8 women across the United States, including states like California, Florida, Nebraska, Oregon, and Washington. What was chilling about Jesperson was his method of hunting and his arrogant complacency. Jesperson specialized in targeting vulnerable women, often hitchhikers or sex workers. He would lure them into the truck cabin, where he would sexually assault and then strangle them. After the murder, he would dump the victims' bodies in secluded spots near truck stops or deserted areas along the highway. The nomadic nature of the crimes made it extremely difficult for local police jurisdictions. They had no evidence to link the cases. Some of Jesperson's murders were even attributed by police to other suspects, a fact that deeply offended him. It was this rage at not being recognized as a serial killer that fueled Jesperson's most arrogant act. He began sending anonymous letters to law enforcement agencies and local media. In these letters, he described his crimes in detail to prove he was the actual killer. And to make sure everyone knew it was him, he signed off with a simple but terrifying symbol: a crude smiley face. From then on, he was dubbed the Happy Face Killer. Jesperson's capture came in 1995 when he killed his final victim, Julie Winningham, in Florida. This time he left more evidence. Police tracked him down and finally arrested him. When caught, Jesperson was surprisingly cooperative, providing details about the murders he had committed across the country. He seemed to find immense satisfaction in being acknowledged as a notorious serial killer. The story of Keith Jesperson is a chilling warning about the evil hiding behind the steering wheel. He exploited the vastness and anonymity of the U.S. highway system to spread terror across the continent. The smiley face he left behind was a cold mockery of his victims and the legal system, forever a reminder that sometimes the most brutal psychopath is the quiet, ordinary man who simply drives by. Story 5. The doctor devoid of empathy. The United States in the 1980s and 1990s, within the context of large modern hospitals, held the belief that a doctor represents life, someone in whom we place complete trust. But this belief was tragically shattered by Michael Swango, an American physician who turned the medical environment into his personal stage for murder. Swango was a man of sharp intellect, a medical graduate, yet he harbored a dark soul and a sick craving for death and suffering. Swango's story begins in Ohio, where he worked as an emergency room intern and began exhibiting strange behaviors. Healthy patients would suddenly decline and fall into critical condition for unknown reasons. Colleagues started noticing that whenever Swango was on duty, the number of unexplained deaths increased. What set Swango apart from most other serial killers was his subtle and sophisticated method of killing. He did not use guns or knives, but poison. Victims. His victims were not only patients, but also colleagues he disliked. Methods. He used toxins like potassium chloride or respiratory paralyzing agents, injecting them intravenously or mixing them into food and drinks. Exploiting his authority and trust within the hospital environment, Swango easily accessed dangerous drugs. These deaths were easily explained away as medical complications or sudden incidents. As accusations began to surface, Swango was fired from several hospitals. However, instead of facing serious criminal investigation, he simply moved states or even countries. He exploited the lack of information exchange among medical licensing boards and the desperation of hospitals needing doctors. He worked in Illinois, then New York, and even managed to find work in Zimbabwe, Africa, to evade the law. At every location, the curse of death followed him. In Zimbabwe, Swango was suspected of causing a string of deaths among emergency room patients. Swango's final downfall came from the persistence of former colleagues who were convinced he was a killer. A pharmacist in New York noticed irregularities in Swango's prescriptions and began an investigation. Eventually, the FBI joined the inquiry, tracking his trail of crimes. In 1997, Swango was arrested. He pleaded guilty to the murders of 4 people and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, a fitting punishment for a serial killer operating under the guise of a medical professional. Authorities believe his total victim count could be up to over 60 people. The story of Michael Swango is a terror of ultimate betrayal of trust. He turned the place presumed to be the safest, the hospital, into the most dangerous. His crimes exposed fatal flaws in the medical oversight system and the cold truth that sometimes the most brutal killer is the one wearing an ID badge, standing by our bedside, devoid of basic human empathy. He was the Doctor of Death. Story 6. The Monster Sleeping in the Woods. Washington State in the 1980s was a land covered in the pristine beauty of pine forests and the flowing green river. It was in the quiet beauty and remoteness of this area that a profound terror took root, lasting nearly 2 decades, known as the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was a truck painter, a man of unremarkable appearance who lived an ordinary married life and held a steady job. His blandness and mediocrity were the perfect disguise for his predatory nature. Ridgway's hunting ground was the dingy roads on the outskirts of Seattle, where he specialized in targeting the most vulnerable women, runaway girls, and sex workers. In the social context of the 80s, these women were often considered forgotten, and their disappearances were rarely prioritized by law enforcement. Ridgway would typically lure the victims into his truck or car with money or promises of help. He would then brutally strangle them. What makes Gary Ridgway one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history is the sheer scale of his crimes and his method of body disposal. He killed continuously over a long period and then would dump the victims' bodies in discrete locations, often near or in the Green River area or deep within the surrounding forests. He frequently returned to the burial sites, performing perverse acts on the decomposing bodies, demonstrating a grotesque obsession with the deceased. In the early 80s, when women's bodies began to be found floating on the Green River, widespread panic gripped the Seattle area. Although police formed a large task force to hunt the killer, Ridgway was always one step ahead. His intimate knowledge of the local terrain and the chaos in the victims' files allowed him to operate seamlessly. Despite being questioned multiple times throughout the 80s and 90s, there was no direct physical evidence to convict him. He consistently passed lie detector tests and maintained his facade of innocence. The downfall of the Green River Killer only came in 2001, when DNA analysis technology was finally advanced enough. Police re-examined semen samples and biological evidence collected from the crime scenes dating back to the 1980s and matched them to Gary Ridgway's DNA profile. Cornered, Ridgway struck a controversial deal with prosecutors. He would confess to all the murders he had committed in exchange for escaping the death penalty. Under this agreement, Ridgway confessed to killing 48 women. During his cooperation with the police, he led them to various burial sites of his victims, exposing a scale of crime no one had dared to imagine before. Investigators believe his actual victim count could be up to over 71 people. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life imprisonment. The story of the Green River Killer is a haunting reflection of police failure and the cold truth that evil can persist ruthlessly for years, concealed by a normal appearance and the marginalization of its victims. He was the monster that slept in the woods, a ghost of violence that forever stained the Green River. Story 7. The Vengeance of the Folk Hero. Thailand, in the years following World War II, was a nation grappling with rapid social change, poverty, and the aftermath of war. In this challenging environment, a primal and gruesome fear spread, associated with the name of a Chinese immigrant, Si Kui. Although his story is laden with controversy and legend, the reality of his crimes cemented him as a lasting symbol of horror in Thai culture. Si Kui arrived in Thailand after the war with hopes of finding a better life, but he found himself trapped in poverty and stigmatized by society due to his origins and physical frailties. He is believed to have developed a deep resentment towards society, particularly towards children. From 1954 to 1958, Si Kui was accused of abducting and murdering several children in the provinces surrounding Bangkok. What made Si Kui's crimes gruesome and generated horrific legends was his method of killing and the rumors of cannibalism. Victims. He targeted children, both male and female. Method. Si Kui typically strangled his victims, then mutilated the bodies. Legend. Folk stories circulated that he consumed the livers and hearts of his victims out of a sick belief that it would make him stronger and cure his ailments. The fear of Si Kui was so great that parents often used his name to scare their children into obedience. If you're not good, Si Kui will come and take you away. He became a national boogeyman, a terrifying reminder of brutal violence. Si Kui's capture came in 1958 after he was caught attempting to burn the body of a young boy. After his arrest, Si Kui confessed to several crimes, including the murder and consumption of some of the victims' organs. This confession solidified the horrific legend surrounding him. Sequay was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. However, the chilling story did not end with his death. The Thai government decided that Sequay's body would be mummified and publicly displayed at the Sri Raj Hospital Forensic Museum in Bangkok. For decades, Sequay's mummy, shriveled and dark, was placed in a glass case with a plaque labeling him as a cannibal, serving as a gruesome cautionary tale. He was not just a killer, but an unwilling hero, a hero of deterrence in a dark sense, a symbol of punishment and fear. It wasn't until 2020, after decades of controversy and calls for respect for human dignity, particularly from those who questioned the fairness of his trial, as he was an immigrant and allegedly tortured, that Sequay's mummy was removed from the display and cremated. The story of Sequay is a horrifying intersection of psychopathic crime, racial prejudice, and cultural manipulation. He is a horror icon who became an integral part of Thai history, a cold reminder of how a killer can be used to maintain social order through the most primal of fears. Story 8. The Basement Catastrophe. Pennsylvania, USA in the 1970s was a quiet area with close-knit communities. But right beneath that tranquil surface, a horrifying story of madness, domestic abuse, and religious crime unfolded, perpetrated by a man named Joseph Callinger. This is a story not just about a serial killer, but about how a family can be drawn into a dark nightmare. Joseph Callinger was a shoemaker, a man with an unremarkable appearance, but his mind was plagued by religious delusions and homicidal commands he believed came from God. He was a survivor of childhood trauma, and his psychiatric disorders grew increasingly severe. The most terrifying aspect of Callinger was that he coerced and manipulated his own son, Michael Callinger, to assist him in his crimes. Michael, a teenager who had been abused and brainwashed by his father, became a reluctant accomplice in the maniacal spree. From 1974 to 1975, the Callinger father and son committed a terrifying series of crimes across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. They broke into homes, kidnapped, tortured, and murdered victims. Callinger's method was driven by sick religious delusions. He believed he was carrying out God's will, purging the world of evil souls. Victims. He targeted families, including children. Method. He would tie up family members, torture them, and then strangle or stab them to death. The basement. Crucially, some victims were held and tortured in the basement of their own homes, turning a familiar space into a living hell. Michael often attempted to resist or persuade his father to stop, but he was always overpowered by Callinger's rhetoric and violence. Michael was another victim of his father's madness, forced to witness and participate in the most grotesque acts. The downfall of the Callinger father and son came in November 1975. After a failed murder attempt, Michael fled and contacted the police, revealing the entire horrifying story of his father's crimes. When police arrested Joseph Callinger, he calmly confessed and recounted the details of the murders, including the earlier murders of two other people, a woman he met and her stepson, before starting the crime spree with Michael. Joseph Callinger was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Michael Callinger was also convicted of murder, but due to his coerced role and history of abuse, he received a more lenient sentence and was later released on parole after rehabilitation. The story of Joseph Callinger is a cold reminder of the danger of sick religious delusions and how abuse can be propagated through generations. It was a family catastrophe where love and protection were replaced by violence and absolute control. The basements of homes, typically used for storing old items, were turned into torture chambers and death sites by a deranged killer, leaving an indelible scar on the souls of the survivors and the entire community. Story 9. The Cold-Blooded Man. Paris, France, during the dark years of World War II, was an occupied city filled with fear, suspicion, and despair. In this chaotic environment, where the line between life and death was fragile, a French doctor named Marcel Petiot built a perfect facade for a cold-blooded serial killer. Petiot was an educated physician, but also had a history of mental instability and minor criminal activity. He always presented himself as a patriot, a member of the French resistance, ready to help those in need. Petiot's targets were people desperately seeking to escape France, primarily Jews, wanted resistance fighters, or the wealthy looking to flee the war. Petiot claimed to these people that he was part of a secret network that could safely transport them to Argentina or other South American countries. He demanded they pay a large sum of money and bring all their most valuable possessions. Petiot's transit room was his house at 21 Rue Le Sueur, Paris. When the victims arrived, Petiot would guide them into a small room, claiming it was where they needed to receive a germ-fighting vaccine before crossing the border. In reality, the vaccine was a lethal dose of cyanide or other poison. Petiot killed systematically, exploiting the victims' desperation and the chaos of the war. He showed no remorse or fear. After the victims died, Petiot would steal all their money, jewelry, and possessions. To dispose of the bodies, Petiot used quicklime or acid, and sometimes he burned the remains in a furnace in his basement. For a long time, no one knew about Petiot's crimes. Everyone assumed the victims had either successfully escaped or had been arrested by the Nazis. The confusion of wartime covered everything. Petiot's downfall came in March 1944. Neighbors at Rue Le Sueur began reporting a terrible stench and thick black smoke billowing from Petiot's chimney. The Paris police, then controlled by the Nazis, came to investigate. They found a horrific scene. Human body parts, clothing, and remains burning in the furnace. Fragments of human bodies were found piled up in the basement, decomposed by quicklime. Petiot briefly escaped, taking advantage of false identities and the chaos following the liberation of Paris, but eventually he was captured. Petiot's post-war trial was a sensational event. He was charged with 27 murders, though investigators believe the true number could be over 60 people. Petiot attempted to argue that he only killed Nazis and collaborators, claiming he was a genuine resistance fighter. However, the evidence of theft and the brutal methods exposed his true nature. Marcel Petiot was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine. The story of the cold-blooded man is a terrifying reminder of how war and desperation can create a perfect environment for pure evil. Petiot was not just a serial killer, but an opportunist who turned fake patriotism into an efficient murder tool. He is a symbol of ultimate betrayal, the man who turned the hope for freedom into a deadly trap. Story 10. The San Francisco Bite Mark. California, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a hub of cultural change, with the hippie movement and an explosion of personal freedom. But amidst that optimism and change, an anonymous terror emerged, spreading fear not only through murders, but also through mocking letters. The Zodiac Killer. He is a ghost, a scar that will never heal in U.S. criminal history. The Zodiac story begins in December 1968, when 2 teenagers were shot dead in their car in Vallejo, California. That was just the start. Over the next year, Zodiac continued to attack and kill young couples in secluded spots, and even a taxi driver in San Francisco. What made Zodiac terrifying and famous was his public provocation. He didn't just kill, he enjoyed playing a cat-and-mouse game with the police and the press. The letters. Zodiac began sending a series of letters to local newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area. In these letters, he boasted about his crimes, mocked the police, and threatened to kill more people if the letters were not published. Ciphers. Along with the letters, he included messages written in complex ciphers. He demanded that the newspapers solve them, claiming they contained his identity or his motives. Symbol. He signed off with a crosshair symbol, a circle with a cross inside, the symbol of the Zodiac sign, hence the moniker Zodiac Killer. Zodiac's attacks included at least 5 confirmed murders and 2 failed attacks. His victims included young couples and a taxi driver. He usually used a gun, but on one occasion, a knife. Confusion and fear enveloped the Bay Area. Police and the FBI poured resources into deciphering the letters and tracing the killer's identity. But Zodiac was always one step ahead. The ciphers were only partially solved, and what they revealed only added to the mystery, leading to no clear suspects. The Zodiac case is not just about the murders, but also about the long-standing failure of law enforcement to capture him. He became a symbol of unsolved crime, an anonymous monster who challenged the entire system. In late 1970 and early 1971, Zodiac's letters became sporadic and eventually stopped. The killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of unsolved crimes and a horror legend that has lasted for decades. Although over the years, detectives and amateurs have proposed various suspects and further deciphered the codes, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. The story of the Zodiac Killer is a wound that never heals in the soul of San Francisco and the entire U.S. He is the embodiment of chaos, the man who turned communication into a terrifying game and turned anonymity into an impenetrable wall. He is the Zodiac Killer, who forever challenged justice and left a cold reminder that sometimes the most frightening evil is the one we can never see. Thank you for listening to this series. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next series.